And thank you for joining us for this IQRN webinar series. My name is Raul Seibing, Senior Trainer for ATLAS.ti and an Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Global Communications at Toshishi University in Kyoto, Japan. And we're happy to share this last webinar of the 2024 calendar year on ethics considerations in qualitative research. So our presenters today, Eric Lee is an Associate Professor and Principal Research Chair, Tier 2, in the Faculty of Management at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus in Kelowna, Canada. Dr. Lee's research is centered on community well-being, social entrepreneurship, and sustainable development. He is particularly known for his work in rural health and food security, where he collaborates with local stakeholders to co-create solutions that address pressing challenges such as healthcare accessibility, food sustainability, and economic inequality. His focus on community-driven initiatives ensures that the outcomes of his research are not only theoretically sound, but also practically applicable, fostering real-world change in the communities he studies. Karin Olson is an adjunct professor in the School of Nursing at the University of British Columbia Okanagan campus in Kelowna, Canada, and professor emerita in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. Dr. Olson's research, rooted in clinical practice and academic settings, has focused on career screening behavior, implementing evidence-based practice, exploring fatigue in the context of cancer, and the developing qualitative and mixed methods research approaches. She teaches both statistics and qualitative research methods. Looking forward to a fascinating and insightful discussion on ethics considerations in qualitative research. Doctors Olson and Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for that, and welcome everyone for that. Is good mornings or good afternoon or good evenings for those who join us from your place for that. And my name is Eric Lee for that, and thank you for the introductions for that. I'm here with Dr. Karin Olson, and then to share a little bit our insights about ethical considerations in qualitative research for that. So we look forward to have a very interactive discussions with you all. I know it's Cyber Mondays for that. I'm very glad to see everyone is showing up kind of today's for our presentations. And our agenda is like this, but I will start with a land acknowledgement next, but then I will briefly talk about the IQRN International Qualitative Research Network. And then, so our presentations will separate into two main parts. The first one will really focus on the four aspects of ethics consideration in qualitative research. And if we have some time, like the last 8 minutes, but that we will go through some ongoing ethics considerations in online research. And we will leave some time for Q&A for that. So look forward to that. So before I start our presentations, I would like to acknowledge that we are joining from the Sioux Okanagan Nations, which is the land host in the UBC Okanagan campus. So we are very thankful for the land keepers to give us a beautiful place for work, for live, and also for fun for that. So I also encourage everyone to think about kind of like acknowledging the land keepers for your own land, where it doesn't matter where you join from for that. I'm really thankful for them to give us the beautiful place today. So the International Qualitative Research Network, or IQRN, is a group of qualitative researchers from around the world. So you can see the beautiful pictures underneath that is all our wonderful advisors. And the purpose for IQRN is to build qualitative research capacity, especially with the emphasis of local scholars who live, study, and work in developing countries or emerging economies. So the primary strategies for us is to really kind of putting together webinars or workshops like this, and then the recording for these webinars are publicly available and also free access to everyone. And our website also have a list of resources of qualitative researcher and also upcoming events related to qualitative research being offered by our own group and ATLAS.ti, our wonderful partners and other groups. So if you're interested with that, here will be the web link, and then so feel free to kind of check out our website and the upcoming event. So I'm not going to go through these slides for that, and Dr. Olson and I is going to be the presenters for today. So maybe we start with the first kind of topics right away for that. When we talk about ethical consideration in qualitative research, and the first things is come to our minds, but that is like the respect, because it's very different from other type of research for that. And qualitative researchers always have the interaction with the participants or the community they are situated. And then so having said it's like we respect is a very fundamental ethical considerations in this type of research. And when we talk about respect, that is what we refer to the right of research participant to ensure the data collected is accurate and also valid. And the other components is in respect because the ongoing qualitative research always kind of like interested in exploring the experience or the vulnerabilities of the marginalized or disenfranchised populations like children and youth, older adults, indigenous communities, or the LGBTQ2 plus communities or visible minorities with that. So I think it's very important to understanding is kind of like how we recognize that vulnerability and live the experience. In qualitative research for that, we all know that especially for those like doing ethnographic research for that, we're not just talking about like spend 30 minutes or 1 hour with the participant. Oftentimes, we're always going back to the community. We always talk to the same participants again to get a little bit more deeper insights about their experience. Having said that, it's like respect and reciprocity, but that is very important in this type of multiple interactions. Because I always say this is like to my students or to my colleagues or to my partners for that. And it's very important to know that it's like there's no one in the community is helping the academic researchers to be successful. It's not really their mandate for any surface organizations to answer our questions or to be our participants. So having that said that they just want to help us to better understand our research questions or to address our research inquiry, they're technically donating their time and also their stories to help us to kind of complete these tasks. So having said that, it's just like the respect is so extremely important. And the last point I would like to share on these slides is would be the autonomy for that. It's really up to them to say yes or no. So it's not kind of like ethical to think about the power dynamics or kind of like the interactions between us with that. So in this research project, autonomy is very important, and also the participant have the rights to decide whether they want to participate or even whether they want to withdraw the studies after that. So and autonomy is also include insurance confidentiality as well. So having said that, like since we are putting together a workshop here for that, I would like to kind of having a little bit small interactive sessions for that. And feel free to use your chat box to share your insights. So we have a scenario here. An instructor at the university requires students to complete a research survey unrelated to the course as condition to receive 5% of their final grade. So it's not a bonus point. So no alternative assignment is offered, and the instructors verify surveys completions before awarding the grade. I would like the group here to share your kind of your insights or your kind of feelings about that. So do you think it's unethical for the instructor to require students to participate in a research survey unrelated to the course for academic credit? So that's the first topic. The second topic would be what are the ethical concerns arise from the scenario? And feel free to share your thoughts in the chat box. And I will probably spend the next couple minutes to review your comments. Please go ahead to do that. Thank you. Thank you, SVU, for that first thought is a bit problematic because 95% is going to be part of the final grade. Very good for that SVU. And yes, but it's just 95% is final grade might be a grade or subgrade if they're not completing the survey for the student. Any other thought? And they don't have the options for alternative assignments. Yep, very good. Any other thought? I think there's might be a couple things for that, and Karen, feel free to chime in for that. And I would like to encourage like the audience to think about the power dynamics as well. And is the topic is not really relevant to the course, but that the professor actually is like asked his or her students to think about that. Okay, well, is that kind of like okay helping me to get the research data, but at the same time for that a little bit like the power distance or the power dynamic between the professor and also the students. But I think that would be quite crucial. Um,
Yeah. And also, because the professor's assigning marks for participation, that means a student is not participating anonymously.
no.
So in terms on the respect side, the student might not say exactly what they think because they don't want the professor to be critical of them or be angry with them.
Yeah, yeah. It might create some intentional bias, but that it depends on the questions. And because of the professor asked me to do that, and it is related to the grade. And as Fia also mentions that, but they just like if the professor is able to see what the responses, because he's also the professor's research, and I think that is create a lot of like kind of like ethical concerns for that, because now the instructor can technically see how the students responds to that. Yeah, for good. Yep.
Yeah. And it used to be, I don't know if it still is, Eric, but it used to be that people could assume that the students were consenting if they did the survey. And I
Yeah.
think nowadays it's more likely where students actually have to sign a consent saying that they're in agreement. At least I know it's that way in some healthcare studies. And
Yep.
a big issue for me here is what does the professor intend to do with the results? If he intends to publish them, he has to talk about consent and how he obtained consent and all those kinds of things. So I'd be very curious about what he planned to do. Is he just trying to give the students an experience of what it's like to be in a study? Or does he have something else in mind?
Yeah, that's definitely for that. Again, is great in discussions here for that. I think that would be more questions about this scenario for that, just like what that study is for. Is there publications or just like giving the student an experience for that is very different type of outcomes. And again, later on today's but we'll talk about the risk components as well for that and how we assess the risk related to this. We just talking about 5% and course grade, or we are talking about like bigger type of considerations or concerns about that. So having said it, just like let's move on and then and when we talk about the power distance, but is come to this particular terminology is about vulnerability for that. In Canada for that, so all the behavior research ethics is guided by the Tri-Council policy statements, or sometimes we call it TCPS2. And vulnerability, according to the statements, for that is defined as the diminished abilities of an individual or group to protect their interests in a research project. It's very obvious, but they just like the professor and the student scenario for that is fall into this particular category for that. So in some case, but that when we talk about factor contributing to the vulnerability, including the limited decision-making capacity, like children or older adults or adults with cognitive impairments, but that they might not be able to give a fully consent or understand the research process. And sometimes there is also limited access to the social group, but that just like they have restricted access to the right opportunity and also the power. And then so the other components in vulnerabilities, but that is also talk about the situations that restrict individuals from exercising their capacity. So again, the classroom setting would be one of the very good example. And also relationship of dependency for that. So think about it, it's a slightly different scenario for that. Physicians and also patients is also in a very similar context for that, because now you're talking about the healthcare service providers versus like a patient, which is in a vulnerable positions for that. And vulnerabilities can vary in degree and over time for that. So today we have seen these like differences for that, and tomorrow it might change the context. So having said that, going back to Karen's some of the comments for that, and seeking consent from an authorized third parties is necessary sometimes to support these vulnerable populations. And also it should be actively involved and participant in decision-making process wherever possible. And ask participants about their feeling, even though you talk to students or is exploring or you have a research on students, but that you always can tell or ask how you think about you feel comfortable to answer these questions or still keeping themselves participating in this research process. And sometimes we have to ensure authorizations of trusted persons like the guardians and to make decisions on participants' behalf if they lose the capacity to decide that. So here would be just like some general examples, but I'm pretty sure we are missing some. So, but I encourage everyone to really think about these directions for that and what vulnerability in terms of the respect we have to. So having said that, just like ways to show respect would be always be aware of our bias, but that it reflects on personal consumptions or prejudices that might influence the research process, and also being culturally sensitive in many ways with that. So because not everyone is from the same backgrounds or receive the same educations or getting a PhD. And then so in many cases, but that we have to acknowledge and respect participants' cultural values, norms, and also their practice. And also it's very important to create safe space for everyone. It's foster an environment that when everyone feel comfortable and valued and secure. And again, earlier I mentioned but that there's no kind of like no one forced them to be a part of our research. And then so the research or the sharing for that is really helping us researcher to get better answers to answer our research questions. So to having said that, creating a safe space is very important. And also respect the time and also sharing for that honor time participations, no matter it's a half an hour or multiple visits or letting someone in their homes and then or letting the researcher in their home for that. So to me for that we have to respect participants' time and sharing. And also participants' privacies for that and make sure it's like the personal informations and ensure confidentiality throughout this research process. So having said that, just I would like to pass on to is that my still my turn, right? Karin. Yep. Okay, yep. So just then we go to the second topics for that, and just to just like go through quickly for that, and then so it's referred to the fair and equitable treatment of all participants. So sometimes we have to avoid those egocentrisms or ethnocentrism. And then thinking about like our perspective and cultural superiority in the research process, and also avoid stereotypes and also bias for that. So make sure it's just like our assumptions is being aware for that in qualitative research. But many times we also ask like researcher reflexivities or the reflections among ourselves that do we have some stereotypes or bias across them, and try not to harm any participant in this process as well. Also, we have to acknowledge the cultural and socio-economic differences, as I mentioned earlier, for that, and what would be the diversities of the cultural practice and the socio-economic context, and ensure accurate representation is very important, kind of in the research process, but that whether we really empathize the participants' voices or portray their experience authentically and respectfully for that. So in qualitative research, we always have the member check process, or sometimes we just we share the publicized results with the participants or the community to make sure it's just like they see the value and also they read before we kind of publicize with that. So and my advice would be not going to the other way. So we publish the paper, just like send them a copy, and or never go back to the community and doing that. But I think that would be another very important. So the other component we will touch on that in the future slides as well. The malfeasance, and then so that would be the part is talking about like prevent harm and protecting participants' well-being throughout the research process. So again, just like quickly go through another slightly different discussions for that, and when we talk about justice for that, and researchers conducting interviews under and to understand the healthcare experience of underdeserved communities. So they schedule interviews during standard working hours, make it difficult for participants with hourly wage jobs to attend without losing income. Additionally, the researcher focus primarily on research participants who are easier to access inadvertently including voices from more marginalized subgroups such as those residents in the rural areas also with disabilities but that. And how does this scenario reflect issues or justice in qualitative research? And what steps could the researcher take to ensure fair and equitable participations. So maybe another couple minutes, but and feel free to share your insights in the chat box and share with us, and we will go through that one by one. Thank you.
Eric, while people are thinking about what they want to say, I know that you do a lot of work in rural areas. And I'm just wondering, in your grants, do you write in travel funds so that people can go into the rural areas and get
Yep.
those data in person? Like,
Yeah,
or how
definitely.
do
But
you do
we,
it?
yeah, we can provide. Again, there's a multiple ways, but we can provide, and then so travel subsidies for that, and again, it's just like through the gift cards or just like honorarium to the participants to come here. And I also would say that the better ways would be actually we go to their community, and then so we might want to just like pay attention to their time, and then so if they're working for that, we might want to schedule the interviews or the meeting in the after work hours or the weekend. And again, the past couple of years, we know that the pandemic changed quite a lot of the way we are doing research for that, and including like having a webinar like today's, but that everyone using Zooms or other kind of online platforms to conducting interviews. And to me, for that, it gave some flexibility, but at the same time, it's going back to the last point, and a couple of colleagues and I is actually really working on how the digital access, and let's say in the rural community for that we might or might not have high-speed internet, that means that it's really limit the Zoom opportunity, and also the let's say older adults for that might not be that tech savvy. So I think that would be a couple of things, but that we have to thinking about okay how to better engaging the marginalized populations or these subgroups for that. And I think that would be some of our sharing, but that there's multiple ways to create these more fair and equitable to have their voices. And but going to them and really understanding the kind of like limitations or challenge for that, I think that would be important. So we do have like two sharing here for that sphere, and then so it doesn't acknowledge cultural and social economic differences when interviews are scheduled during work hours. For that, I think that's very good reflections for that as well to ensure accurate representations, and it doesn't include all voices. But yeah, thank you for your insight. And yep, so that would be a questions, and then so as a freshman student, so we just like got into research and first half. Qualitative research. Can you give any tips to get into since professor are not helping for that? Okay, we'll come back to these particular questions after presentation. How that's um, yeah, definitely there's different ways for that. Thank you, Rob. So, any other thought about and these particular questions? I think I share some of the kind of like way to do better, and then would be kind of like really think about the schedule and try to be flexible as a researcher or research team for that. And sometimes I would say that in for some international research I'm part of for that, and having a translator handy and also learning a little bit like their language, but there's also the other ways to show some respect and also justice to make sure they're comfortable to answer and or to participate in the research in their own language for that, because sometimes we can't just expect everyone speak English while we are traveling around the world or to different communities for doing that. So I think that would be another component it's beyond this particular context, but make people feel comfortable and safe to be a participant. So having said that, just we are almost halfway through our webinars, but I just want to move and on to our last two topics and about just and that. So again, Karen, that's your turn for that is that duty of preventing harm. Go ahead. Yep.
Yes. This is a really important consideration in any kind of research. So as the researcher, you need to think about what might the potential risks be to participants, including things like emotional distress. Some topics are very hard to talk about. So it's important to keep in mind that you ask the patient to tell you about their experience, understanding that they will not likely tell you the whole story, but they'll tell you the parts they're willing to share. And that is a gift, you have to say. So sometimes it's clear that you have inadvertently triggered distress. And it's important for you to anticipate that and have supports available. So in my own research with cancer patients, I always have an arrangement with the psychology department so that if people who are upset inadvertently because of the study questions can get support from a psychologist at the hospital. And you will have your own resources for doing things like that, formal and informal. The most important part, of course, is setting it up so that there's no financial requirement to get support for the patient. Or the participant doesn't have to pay any money to get support, is what I'm trying to say. Here we talk about confidentiality and privacy again. The main thing here is to think about how you're going to store your data. You cannot store it on your computer. It needs to be stored on a hard drive someplace where it is encrypted and protected so that nobody else can access it. Just think about if you lost your computer and you had all your data there, and now all of a sudden that information becomes available to whoever finds your computer. So it's very, very important to have careful attention to storage of your data, and you store it in a way that even when it's on that hard drive, it's all anonymized. So you might say, person number 1, and here's the interview observations, whatever else, person number 2. And somewhere else, not in that file, you have to have a record of who person number 1 is, who person number 2 is. I think, and Eric has already said a little bit about cultural sensitivity, but it's important to keep in mind that some of those cultural sensitivities will not be obvious because the person you're interviewing may look just like you and may speak your language, but they come from a different culture. And so you need to know, give people a chance to talk about who they are and how they see the experience that they're having.
That's wonderful for that. It's back to me for that. I think that would be really follow up what Karen's talk about preventing harm. I think some of the part we have to assess what type of harm or risk associated with the research projects put together. I think that's to some extent that is also start answering some of your questions for that. So when we talk about risk for that, most of the time we only think about the risk to participant, but also invite everyone to think about what would be the risk to the community partners. If you're partner with a nonprofit organizations or you're partner with a government unit or you're partner with a private organizations for that. So what would be the risk into these community partner? Of course, like sometimes we say that, okay, we are doing the field work or we have the ethnographer or we are just like the interviewees or interviewers going to the field for that. Are there any risk as to the researcher or the research team ourselves? And of course, like sometimes we have to ask like what would be the risk to the society as a whole. So I'm not going through all these details and in this like box, but that and you will have all access to the recording as well as the PowerPoint slide that we put together today for that. But some is really talking about the emotional distress and loss of privacies from an individual perspective. To a larger is talking about the erosion of trust or reinforcing of inequality for that. That's a spectrum of risk we experience as a qualitative researcher for that. I think it's very important to think about what would be the appropriate mitigations or risk mitigation strategies. And I just list some of the strategies here and really thinking about from framing the research questions or method to address the systemic issues, responsibility to going back to the informed consent components and how you ensure confidentiality and anonymity in the research process to make sure like the information participant provides to us is being protected. And sometimes we have to also think about what would be the safety protocol for field work for that. And sometimes, again, in some cultures or in some countries for that, and female researcher will be always kind of like, or male researcher are not going to be able to interview female participants for that. And having said that, like, that would be some arrangement and working potentially with some local partners or organizations to make sure you still have access to the participants' pool, but at the same time, it's not violating these like cultural norms or expectations. So jump to the last part for that and promotions of well-being. And I think Karin, you will come back to this. Go
Right.
ahead. Yep.
So the most important point here is that it's the responsibility of the researcher to ensure that the research benefits the participants and their communities. It's never okay to conduct a deceptive study, to inadvertently collect information that might be harmful to the people that you're studying. And we've talked a lot about inadvertent harm through risk mitigation. And in your proposals, when you're developing them, you have to think about the possible problems you might encounter and talk about how you plan to address them. I think in the interest of time, that's as much as I'll say about that unless people have questions. So over to you, Eric.
Okay, good. Yeah, we have a couple of things we would like to talk about for that. So we quickly go through the four aspects like respect, justice, and promotion of well-being, and also prevention of harm for that. So what would be some key takeaway from today's, and then we'll kind of like, I think we have a little bit time to jump on the additional topics for that. And always prioritize the rights and autonomy and emotional well-being of our participant and also the community. And also think about like the representations component we talked about earlier today is to ensure fairness. And again, we talk about a few tips or a few strategies to minimize risk, but then and also protect the participants. And always follow the ethical guidelines. And then every institutions or most of the institutions for that should have a research ethics department or unit. And then so I would say that work closely with the team and just make sure. And then so you follow all the ethical guidelines, which is setting up by the governments or the educational institutes for that. And also promoting the well-being for that. Always think about the benefit participants and also the community have, and what will be the impact from a mental, emotional, or physical health for that, and risk for that, and proactive measures for that. And there's always one questions and the research ethics protocol or the application will ask the researcher would be, so what would be the risk and how you mitigate them for that. And we highly recommend that to think thoroughly rather than just, oh, there's another box for that, and I just have to fill in the application form. But that would be the opportunity for everyone to think about what type of risk could potentially the research teams or these research studies can bring to the community or the participants. So I would like to spend maybe probably 5 to 6 minutes to go through some emerging ethical considerations, and in particular online qualitative research environments. But that before we jump to that, there's a few things I would like to kind of share with the participant here today, and it's not uncommon nowadays, but that to have third-party services in qualitative research and outsourcing transcriptions service is very common. So having said that, just like if you have the budgets or if you're willing to do that, and then so sometimes transcriptions also involve the translations. Just make sure everyone's or every involved party adheres to the confidentiality agreements and also handle sensitive data responsibly for that, like what I mentioned or what Karen mentions, but it just like is not right to store the personal data or the research data in a personal computer. So how you kind of like respectfully and also safety transfer the files to the third party, for that there's always some protocols you have referred to and to ensure data security. So the other components for that, and I would like to encourage with thinking about like publishing personal artifacts and also identifiable informations like photos or videos or personal record or collections. But this is not just like talking about the voice during the interview, but it's more talking about the artifact participants share with you or the community share with you for that. And consent must be contained and obtained from the individuals or the family involved, and also you have to assess the harm and also the privacies related to this kind of like publishing these artifacts as well. So the last components that we would like to share would be more like interviewing with families and also parents versus students for that, and what would the power dynamic between that? You get consent, or can you talk to, or just like the parents speak on behalf of the students? I think that would be very important components qualitative research have to remind ourselves of that. So how to represent your participant, including the children of the families, put that equally, and also make sure both parties feel comfortable to talk about their experience as well. So to end up our presentations for that would be something we highly likely, hopefully we will put together another one and similar on these topics in 2025 for that. So there's a lot of like qualitative research that using online materials or doing online research and then or using the internet to collect data. And then, so here will be some of the observations Karin and I put together, and always pay attention to the copyright. And so, yes, the internet seems like you Google search or you kind of go to different social media for that. There's a lot of quote unquote data or informations out there. But really carefully to think about who actually own that set of data. Even though you see them on the internet, doesn't mean that you can use that right away or without consequences for that. So the permission to use for that is very important. And also one would be the consent process. So people share some thought or review comments on Google. It doesn't mean that it's like they agree to be a part of someone's research project. And then so having said it, just like what would be the consent process and also publishing the online data, what would be the legal requirements and the consent requirements, but that and some of us heard about that technique is called data scraping technologies, or and then so it's technically it's talking about like some programmers writing a program or code to access to let's say Facebook, and then so to download certain Facebook groups, comments or the interactions. So technologically for that is very common, and then so private sector is doing that. But I'm really going back to the research community for that. I will really want everyone to talk to the university authority to see whether you can actually use that technique or not. Because when we're using this data scraping technology for that, to some extent, for that is also damaging the website. So it's really come to some potential legal cases will come up against the universities or the research team themselves for that. So having said this, like the technology is out there, but we have to make sure we have the rights to use that or the other party understand that. So you're using these like data scraping technologies with their permission. So that's I think that's would start kind of like things getting more complicated, but I think it's very important to have that process in place. And of course, like we are talking about generative AI in the past like couple of years, but that it becoming more and more common. So I see researchers kind of like talking about using generative or AI generated type of like participant data or interviews data for that, and really kind of hit on today's topic for that. Is that ethical? Is that something we have to look into? And eventually to go to the academias for that, is this work is publishable, or that would be a new insight. I'm always say that it's like there's always pros and cons when we talk about new technologies coming out with that. But what I encourage everyone in this room is really think about how to use the technologies ethically. And then when we talk about doing research for that, is that really makes sense to use like AI generated type of like interview data for that. And last but not least, but that is like always think about the ethicals and also the legal obligations when we do going online research and beyond as well. So having said that, just like wow, it's a good 40 minutes of sharings for us, and then so we would like to kind of a concluding for that. This would be five kind of a key points we would like to share with you today. We just like summarize them here, and thinking about the ethical integrities, thinking about like the resilience of online research, and also how to protect vulnerable populations or marginalized population in the research process. And I think that would be the last components. Last two components is extremely important: transparency and accountability for that. We don't want to hide anything under our bed. And then so just like be clear, be honest. Okay, that would be some of the risk participants have to face or experience in the future. And then so we have to communicate that very clear, and also being accountable and commit to all the ethical standards setting up by the governments or your research institute for that would be extremely important. So having said that, just I thank you so much for joining us today. For that, we will leave the next night 15-20 minutes for Q&A sessions. Thank you.
And many thank yous to Drs. Olson and Lee. And we have some time for questions and answers, and our discussion period starts now. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat. If you want to ask a question anonymously, please ask your questions in the Q&A. There was a previous question earlier. It comes from Zilahuma Khan. As a fresh student who just has gotten into research for the very first time and someone who's really, really interested in qualitative social work, can you give any tips to how to get into it since professors are not helping the students? And I think that last part, I think that depends on institution to institution. You might get some really supportive faculty. Sometimes you may not. You might be left on your own. And so maybe some tips from either of you.
I would say maybe you could email Eric and myself and let us know where you are, because as Raul was saying, it's true that some universities don't have any courses on qualitative research, or they might be courses in a faculty other than your own, and that's why you're not aware of them. So we both have quite large networks, and Raul as well. Maybe email all three of us. And between the three of us, we can likely find you at least somebody who lives nearby to talk to. I know that in some students' committees that I was on at the University of Alberta, it was in a faculty that I didn't normally work in, but I was invited to come in as a committee member because I knew the methodology. So it's not uncommon to add somebody to a students' committee as a methodologist. That does not get away from the fact that you need to have a chance to do some studying in qualitative research. And so I can certainly put you in touch. I'm thinking about Research Talks, Ray Mietta's program. There are a number of pretty good online training programs that offer coursework, the equivalent of coursework. You wouldn't get university credit for it, but you'd at least learn how to do qualitative research. So please email us and we can put you in touch with people that might be suitable, and maybe say a little bit more about what you're hoping to study.
Yeah, we'll probably add on what Karin is sharing for that, and I think And we have the community here, but I think here would be some of the resources you can access to. Again, joining the webinar like this, and now you're building up the connections to different qualitative researcher. And I think that would be the right way you doing that to really expand your connections beyond your own departments or program. And I would say there's so many online resources here and there for that, but really talk to us whether we can guide you to the some of the resources we would like to recommend you. And the other components I really say that is like sometimes talk to the libraries, but that they might have their own network. And at UBC for that we always have a community of researchers or scholars network. And it's a multidisciplinary for that, so you might see some people, but what the community is doing for that they share their research challenge, or I don't know how to get consent, or I don't have access to this community for that, can someone help? And that's the community of scholars, and kind of they jump in and answer some of the questions for that. And find the mentorship within your own program and beyond your program. I think that would be a very important academic process. And go to academic conferences, no matter it's virtual ones or the physical ones for that. And I think that would be another way to build some connections or meet some mentors, like what Karin mentions, but they could be your additional committee members, or it could be your external examiners, and or it could be your future colleagues. And then so you never know how these connections can bring you to the future. But I think in the beginning stage of your graduate program and of your research for that, I think really kind of like building connections to different resources or access to different set of mentors, but that would be very important.
Yeah. I think the maybe the thing I would say for people who are just getting into a research track, and I think I'm assuming, yeah, a fresh student. I think the one thing I would say is in your first year, go wide. You will have coursework in your program. You'll have scholars in your program, but don't be afraid to branch out. I think for me, most of my coursework was in education, but I also took courses in anthropology because I wanted to be an ethnographer, and so being able to connect the different networks is going to be necessary in the later stages of your academic career. But in order to do that, you need to go wide. You need to go to network at different places, and so that you can get a bird's eye view, and then later zoom in to the research area that you really want to do. So, but anyways, it does require, all of us would need to know more about the specifics that you have in mind.
Yeah.
Um, so we're waiting on other questions. Please feel free to ask them in the chat or Q&A. Maybe a question from me while we're waiting is that entire presentation on ethics, very insightful, but not not many mentions, if at all, about IRB or ethics review. So that kind of suggests that the discussion here goes above and beyond what what the ethics review board will look like. So maybe the question is like what what would an IRB or an ethics review board not cover that is really important to cover and that you have discussed in this presentation today?
Well, when I first started doing qualitative research and took a proposal to the IRB at my cancer hospital, they asked me why I was there. This wasn't a clinical trial. That meant that this wasn't even research. And so I said, oh, well, we at a university, we have other departments, English departments, they do research. Humanities does research, sociologists does research. They don't do clinical trials, I can tell you that. So sometimes it's really about teaching your IRB why what you do is actually research. And
Mhm.
and I guess the point that Raul is making, which we sort of assume and maybe shouldn't have, is that ethics review is always required. You can't just write a proposal and go and do it. That's because the idea is that if there's an ethics review board who checks your work, they might spot something that you missed. Or they might say, oh, I don't understand why you're doing it this way. So you get to teach them why. And it becomes a mutual process of growth. And it's actually really, really fun. I I did research for a lot of years, and I think there was one time that the ethics committee said, looks good, carry on. Usually they come back to you with a few changes they'd like to see, maybe in your consent form, or they want you to add a paragraph about something. For example, what about if you start collecting data in a agency of some kind, let's say a school, and you're an educator, a professional educator, you're an expert, you're also a researcher. And I'll pick on Raul now. So, Raul, you start to see something that is really problematic. You see bullying, you see children who are being mistreated by other children, and the teachers don't seem to be responding. What are you going to do about that? So now you have an ethical dilemma, don't you? So you need, when you're planning your study, to think about all the possible ethical dilemmas you might face and talk about how you're going to handle them. So you might go to the agency and say, now, thank you for welcoming me into your facility. I would like to have a protocol for how we should handle things if I see something that would be considered problematic. And we'll go from there. I do know of somebody who conducted a study in a long-term care facility, and she realized that some people were not getting water and their meals were left for them to feed themselves. Well, they couldn't do that. So they were dehydrated and were starving to death. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, your research question goes out the window. There's something much
Yeah.
more fundamental that you have to deal with. So that is the part, and that's part and parcel of ethical research.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry for the soapbox, but I just had to
No
say it.
worries.
No, it's good. Yeah, no, I think I will add on, but I'm part of the research ethics board at my universities for 9 years for that. And again, two kind of a response to what your questions is and role for that. One is, and the research ethics board is more like a registry for that. So every researcher, academic researcher, or that pretty much like you submit the application and grant the permissions. Now you satisfy all the ethical kind of a guidelines, and then you're good to go to collect your data. It's more like the protections for both sides, institutionally for that. So your universities or research institute don't want to see any researcher to mess up the process, and suddenly come back for that. Oh, there's a researcher from your university is kind of like collecting data without your permissions or awareness for that. I think that would be a big thing for institution. And going back to some of our presentations content today for that is also protecting both sides, the participant and also the research team for that, because sometimes through this process, even the researcher, especially sometimes students too, for that, they don't realize that there's some risk for that kind of associated with these research studies for that. When they go to the field for that, they just don't know what to manage or how to manage. So having a research ethics board or IRB for that is helping to kind of like, and then so to navigating those potential risks is also important. And one quick comment for that, I would say that researcher always think about, oh, what's my research topics or what would be my research questions, and then so how I recruit the participants, but da 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 da. But in the research ethics process, I always say that it would be nice to reverse that process and think about if I'm a participant, so how you get my attentions. Okay, there's a research process might be interested for me, and then so from a ad or maybe some online Instagram posts or whatever, some word of mouth invitations for that. So I think as a researcher, we always have to think reversely and then to think about, okay, when would be the first point of contact and how they reach out to the researcher, hey, I'm interested in this process, but or in these studies, but that, and send me the information or maybe set up an interview. And once you kind of arrive the Zoom room or the interview room for that, okay, what would be the debriefings or the consent process, and how you kind of, now you have my data, and how you reporting or share the data and also the findings with the participants for that. And to me for that, it's very important to bring these two parties together to make sure it's like they are aligned with each other rather than just like the researcher are ticking and then the participant is never get back or have a chance to talk back to the researcher for that.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think if I could share one anecdote before we move on to the next question, is respect is mentioned many times in this presentation, and I think that's the main. Of course, that should be the main guiding principle. And so, I did an ethnographic study in a classroom in Japan, and and as a former, well, at the time, as a former English teacher, and work is studying another English teacher and their students. And there was, I would count, and this never got into the data analysis, but one or two anecdotes where the textbook would say something, the teacher would teach that answer for a certain grammar rule, and I would think, this textbook's wrong. There's something wrong with this thing, but I don't want. But and then a student would say, "Is this the right answer?" They would ask me because they know I'm an English teacher, but what do I do in that situation? Do I correct them and say, "Yeah, no, this is what I really think," in which case I would try to help them with their English, or but that might get in the way of the teacher. Like, that might, I'm coming up against the teacher where, we have different answers. So I have to deal with that entanglement about whose interest am I protecting, and how do I serve all of them at the same time? And so those who go into the field for over a longitudinal period will likely come across these entanglements, and they have to deal with those entanglements in a respectful manner. There's no clear answer. There's no prescriptive rules about it. But if you deal with it in a respectful manner and you try to leave the context better than you found it, everything else should fall into place. So,
That's a really good point, Raul. And if I could just add one tiny little thing is when that happens, I would be inclined to write that into the context of the study so that you don't lose track of it, because
yep.
it will change the nature of the data that you get from that person and in that setting and that teacher afterward. And in healthcare, we come across this all the time where the person's health is in jeopardy. And so as a nurse, I say, okay, change hats, research hat off, nurse hat on, and we deal with it. And sometimes that means that we withdraw that person from the study just because there's too much work to do on the healthcare side. And you realize it's not really suitable to have that person in a study.
Yeah.
But these are really great examples of, I guarantee you're going to meet up with this stuff when you get into the field for sure.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. IRB is just a starting point. Or so let's take a question. Asfia Taji says, I'm curious in thinking about participants' mental well-being. We can have some emotional safeguards in our research, but a method that might work for one participant may not work for another person. So how can we navigate that as an interviewer?
Good question.
Uh,
And I have done a little bit of work in the area of depression and anxiety because it's so closely aligned with fatigue, which is my main area. And what the ethics committee required me to do, because I was studying people with depression, I had to end the interview by asking the question, do you feel safe? Are you likely to harm yourself or another person? I was very uncomfortable asking those questions, but I would get to that point in the interview and the participant would just smile and they'd say, was waiting for you to ask that. I always get asked that, even at the end of a clinical visit. So, I think if you're worried that the study is inadvertently causing mental health issues for a person, you need to follow that up.
Mm.
And you might need to withdraw the person from the study because it's not suitable for them. And it's great that you're raising this question now because you've lots of time to think about it.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts, Eric, before we close out?
I think I agree with like Karin, but I think sometimes it's difficult to recruit participants sometimes, but the researcher have to make a critical decisions for that whether it's ethically to keep the participant kind of in the studies or we have to let go that data points for that. And but I see it more like the midway for that you can also think about how you adjust, let's say, your question set. And I know that just like we always do an interview for that, we have to develop an interview guide, but it's not hard code. So you always have kind of a follow-up questions, or you can change a little bit like the tones or the way to present that questions. And based on different participants' like emotional response for that, I think that would be some flexibility as a researcher for that. So you can kind of think about how to make it more comfortable. And as I mentioned, but I just like while creating a safe space is very important. So where they're comfortable. But to me, for that, I have some experience too. For that, you just like hesitate to ask some of the questions because oh, it's a sensitive topic. But similar to what Karen's experience with that, just sometimes you're just like surprised with that, and the participant experience like 100 times, and people ask the same questions about their traumas or kind of like and challenging experience in the past with that because they have that. And I think to me as a researcher for that, sometimes we just need to kind of like follow the flow of the conversations. But very good questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we will have to leave it there. I want to thank Dr. Eric Lee, Dr. Karin Olson, and I want to thank all of the attendees today for their insightful questions. That concludes this webinar as part of the International Qualitative Research Network's periodic webinar series, and that closes out the 2024 calendar year. If you have interest in future webinars, please visit the IQRN website. As well as for other webinars hosted by ATLAS.ti, visit the ATLAS.ti website for further information. For Dr. Karin Olson, Dr. Eric Lee, my name is Raul Seibing, Senior Trainer for ATLAS.ti. Thank you for joining this webinar, and we will see you again. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you. Take
you.
care,
Bye,
everyone. Happy
everyone.
holidays. Yeah.